Today, most of us are familiar with binge watching. We can go to an app and we can look at a whole series that's been put together over time. And we can watch one episode of the series right after the other if we want to for an extended period of time. But now, back in the old days, when some of us watched TV, we had to wait a week before the next episode of our favorite program came out. And it was particularly intriguing and sometimes aggravating when one episode of our favorite television program ended with a to be continued. Well, that's exactly what is kind of happening in the book of Acts, especially in Acts 25. I'm Steve Lusk with the Red Bank Church of Christ. And all this year, we've been looking at the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And we're calling this series Christ and His Church because Luke tells us about Christ, his life, his teachings, ultimately his death and resurrection. And then Acts tells us how the message of Christ and the mission of Christ continued in the first century through the early disciples of Jesus. And one of the key characters in the book of Acts, in fact, really from about chapter 9 on, probably the main character in the book of Acts is Paul, Saul of Tarsus, who later becomes the Apostle Paul. And especially beginning in about chapter 13, when Paul begins his missionary tours, we see Paul going from place to place to place. And in a lot of ways, all of the chapters of Acts are kind of to be continued chapters, but especially in this section where we're in now, Acts chapter 25. You see, in Acts 21, Paul is arrested at Jerusalem because there's an uproar. Some Jews were jealous of him, and they got him arrested by the Romans soldiers. He tries to give his defense there in chapter 22. He's kind of shouted down and taken into protective custody. In Acts chapter 23, he appears before the Sanhedrin Council, and that's not a satisfactory meeting necessarily. They're not able to really pin anything on him. He's always seems to be vilified or justified in his actions and never found guilty of anything. But he's kind of moved along in the process. They find out he's a Roman citizen, and so he's protected by the Romans and sent to Caesarea, where he appears before Governor Felix in Acts chapter 24. Now, this whole governor thing, and we're going to be introduced to a king today. It's kind of a complex way of looking at the political structure and the governmental structure in the first century of the Roman Empire. But Felix is a governor over a particular region, and Paul appears before him, as we looked at last week. And it sort of concludes with Felix trembling, and chapter 24 ends with Felix's term as governor ending and a new governor, Festus, taking his place as governor. And one of the first things that Festus does, perhaps in order to help keep the peace and to maintain order in the Roman Empire, he goes to Jerusalem. And while in Jerusalem, he is confronted with these Jewish leaders who are really after Paul. They beg him to bring Paul to Jerusalem to stand trial there, but Festus feels like something's not quite right about that, and so he says, "No, we're gonna try him over in Caesarea. That's where we're going to listen to him." And so that's kind of how chapter 25 of the book of Acts opens. Festus spends about 8 or 10 days, the Bible says, in Jerusalem, and then he returns to Caesarea. And Paul appears before him, and some of the Jews came to Jerusalem or from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and they make some very serious charges against him, which the Bible says they could not prove. And again, it shows that Paul really wasn't doing anything wrong. They were just giving these trumped up charges against him and trying to try him on the basis of some of the things that they held against him. So Paul says, I've done nothing wrong here. I've done nothing against the law of the Jews. I've done nothing against the temple, and I've certainly done nothing against Caesar, against Roman law. And so Paul says or Festus says to Paul, kind of wanting to curry favor with the Jews, he says, can you go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? And Paul says, look, I'm where I need to be. I'm in Caesar's court. I'm standing trial here. I've not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know. He says, if I'm found guilty of doing anything deserving death, then I don't refuse to die. I'll take that punishment. But if these charges brought by the Jews are not true, then no one has a right to hand me over to them. So he says, I appeal to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he could appeal to the highest court in the land. It'd be sort of like saying, I'm taking this all the way to the Supreme Court today. I'm appealing to Caesar. And so Festus is seemingly taken aback by this somewhat. So he confers with some of his leaders. And afterwards he says, okay, you've appealed to Caesar. I'm going to take you to Caesar. You know, we know that Paul wanted to go to Rome, but I seriously doubt that he had planned to go to Rome as a prisoner of Rome. And yet, as we're going to find out in the following chapters of the book of Acts, that's exactly what happens. Paul gets his wish of going to Rome, but it's not perhaps exactly as he wanted to. So the Bible tells us in Acts 25 here that Festus is governing over this region, and King Agrippa and Bernice arrive. Now, who are King Agrippa and Bernice? Well, this is where this whole Roman government arrangement becomes a little bit convoluted. Agrippa is of the Herodian line. You remember Herod the Great, his grandfather was a ruler of Rome. And then we remember in Acts chapter 12, his uncle, another Herod, had James killed and then falls to his death there in Acts chapter 12. So he's in that line, and we're not exactly sure what realm he had control over, but he was given some authority and some respect as being from the Herodian line, even though he didn't necessarily govern Rome as such. And so they had come, Agrippa and Bernice had come to Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus, the new governor. They wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page and wanted to pay him some honor. It would have been a kind of a two-way street in terms of the honor. Festus would have received them gladly and would have thought that a high honor for Agrippa to come to him. And then Agrippa wanted to curry favor with Festus as well as the Roman representative from that particular region. And so they were spending some time there in Caesarea with Festus. And so Festus discusses Paul's case, this situation that has been handed down to him from Felix with King Agrippa. It's interesting because King Agrippa knew a lot about the Jews. In fact, some rabbinic tradition tells us that he would even argue points of the Jewish law with the rabbis. He was very interested in the Jewish religion and was very familiar with it. And Festus says, Felix left me this prisoner. I go to Jerusalem. The chief priest brought charges against him, asked that he be condemned to die. I told him that it's not Roman law to hand people over without a proper trial and without an opportunity to defend himself. So they come here, and I didn't delay. I went ahead with a speedy trial, but when his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him with any of those crimes I had expected. I expected them to maybe bring some Roman law into the equation, but they had not. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their religion. And I like this passage right here in Acts chapter 25, verse 19 or so, where it says that they had dispute with him about their religion and about a dead man named Jesus, whom Paul claimed was alive. And so in the broadest sense possible, Festus sort of understood what this was all about, even though he didn't know any of the details and certainly doesn't seem to be aware of Jesus or of the movement of Christianity that had already taken place here in the first century. He says, I was at a loss. So I asked him, do you want to go back to Jerusalem? Would you be willing to do that and stand trial? Instead, he appealed to Caesar. And so Agrippa says, well, I'd like to hear this man myself. Again, being familiar with Jewish law, Jewish customs, having lived among the Jews, and having even argued Jewish law with some, he wanted to hear about this whole thing that was taking place. And so as chapter 25 comes to a close, It describes how Agrippa and Bernice came in to an audience room with a bunch of high-ranking officers and leaders from the city of Caesarea, and it's great pomp and circumstance. You can imagine it's almost like a parade or a ceremony of sorts as they come in, and then um, Festus commands that Paul be brought in, and Festus says, "King Agrippa and all who are present, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned to me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting out that he should not have any right to live any longer. He's not worthy of living. He should be put to death. But he has made his appeal to Caesar. I found nothing worthy of death in these accusations. He's made his appeal to Caesar. And so I really don't know what to write to Caesar, his majesty, about with regard to the accusations. So I've brought him here in this setting before Agrippa and Bernice and all these soldiers and ranking men of the city, these important people, in order to investigate this further. So, because I don't want to send a prisoner on to Rome without some specific charges left or made against him. And then that's where we can sort of pencil in to be continued, because Acts chapter 26, then Paul makes his defense before Agrippa, and that closes Acts chapter 25. So we're sort of left hanging here, as we have been at the end of several of these chapters, with what's next. In a lot of ways, it's an intriguing story. It's an interesting story. It's a powerful story. But a couple of things that I want to point out. First of all, Paul used wisdom in understanding what his rights were as a Roman citizen in order to avoid being railroaded, being lynched, in essence, by the Jews. I think that reminds us that Jesus had told his followers, you need to be as wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. It's clear that Paul is following that admonition. He is very harmless. In fact, no legitimate charges have stuck against Paul, but he's continuing to be wise in buying himself time. I think also Paul sees every chance he gets, he has an opportunity to tell his story and to tell the story of Jesus. I think that's a very important point for us to understand. Even when circumstances were not as Paul would have liked. Now, as I said, this is not the way Paul wanted to go to Rome, but he's seeing a way to Rome where he can actually testify of Jesus Christ and reveal the scriptures to people that need to hear them. And so he's taking advantage of this bad situation, and he's doing the very best he can with it. And we see Paul doing that all throughout the book of Acts, taking the best of a bad situation. We find ourselves sometimes in difficult situations, but are we making the best of those situations? So a couple of important lessons that we can learn there. Number one, that we need to be wise. We need to be shrewd in the way we deal with things that happen in the world, but also to be harmless. And then secondly, that we take advantage of every opportunity to tell people about Jesus, about our story of how Jesus has impacted our lives and what it can mean to them as well. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this intriguing part of the story, and I hope that you'll continue to follow along with us in our weekly readings from the book of Acts now, as we're winding down toward the end of the year. There's just a few more chapters to go in Acts, and we're going to see how this story ends, which, again, it's an interesting end to the story of the book of Acts. And there's some things that are going to be left hanging, but there's also some lessons there for us. So I hope that you'll continue to read along with us. And as always, if we can ever help you at the Red Bank Church of Christ, please feel free to get in touch with us. We invite you to come and worship with us on the Lord's Day, on Sundays. We meet every Sunday at 9:30 for Sunday school and 10:30 for worship. You can come and visit with us on Wednesday evenings when we have Bible studies at 6:30 p.m. There's something for everyone. Or maybe you just have a question you'd like for us to address, or some other need that you could share with us. Write us, call us, get in touch with us via our website. Send us an email. We'd be glad to hear from you. Hope and pray that you have a great day and that you take advantage of the opportunities that you have today to tell someone about Jesus and how he has impacted and changed your life. Thank you so much for joining us, and God bless.